Additionally, we had the Paradise Creek Regional Alternative High School that went into the old Circle K building in the Motor Business District. And a zoning complaint was received both on this use as well as that use. Paradise Creek was allowed at that point in time, again, under a similar category of use, but it also included commercial schools as a use by right in the Motor Business District at that time. So we read commercial schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, governmental offices, libraries, parks, museums, art galleries, police and fire stations, and similar public or private institutions. And again, the zoning administrator at that time felt that the alternative high school was very similar in nature to these uses in commercial schools and determined that they were a use by right in that zoning district. Both of those interpretations did have a potential conflict in the code, and that was specifically that educational institutions, that definition came back in 1990 and existed there. And so that would have addressed a private college use, and it was defined in the code, and it was not specifically named in that zoning district. The same thing for schools. Schools that were operated under a K through 12 age range were also defined in the code and was not specifically named into this category of uses in the Motor Business District. Commercial schools was named, obviously, but that is a different definition than just schools in general. So those interpretations and the allowance and existence of those two uses appear to conflict with those definitions, and the fact that our zoning code is what's deemed to be an exclusionary code. That is, if a use is not named in a zoning district, then it's deemed not to be a permitted use in that zoning district. The City Council at that time referred the matter to the Planning and Zoning Commission to conduct a comprehensive review of the allowance of schools in commercial zoning districts. So it was not merely focused on educational institutions. It was schools, commercial schools, and educational institutions were reviewed, and all of the city's commercial zoning districts were evaluated at that time. And Art probably recalls this from P&Z days. Well. Yes. The commission conducted a great deal of work and provided their recommendations to the City Council that was adopted through Ordinance 2005-33 in December of 2005, and that modified the allowance of those uses in the city's commercial zoning districts. When the council forwarded the matter to the Planning and Zoning Commission to review it, the Planning and Zoning Commission discussed the matter over the course of 10 meetings and hearings, accepting significant written testimony and over 8 hours of oral testimony during that time period. And the file from that time period is somewhat thick, and this is all the materials, written materials that was received at that time. I was going to scan this in and put it in the packet, but I thought that might be a bit much just yet. But that was the discussion that was held, and the work that P&Z did. And as Art can recall, the commission did spend a great deal of time working on the discussion. The council received the commission's recommendations on November 14th, and the council conducted a hearing on December 5th. They passed the ordinance under first reading with some minor amendments, and then the council then reconsidered it on December 19th, and at that point passed it under suspension of the third reading, and that is what ultimately amended the code. The ordinance allowed schools, commercial schools, and educational institutions as a conditionally permitted use in the residential office, neighborhood business, motor business, general business, central business, with the exception of schools was excluded, and as a use by right in the university zone, which it previously was already. They also included a parking standard for educational institutions, so the use was named and defined in the zoning code, but in our table, where all the uses are listed in the required off-street parking, they didn't exist, and there was not a parking standard for that use. So that was included to the table, but that would only, by the way the parking standards work, it would only apply to those uses located outside the central business district. Everything inside the central business district is exempted from that table underneath the code. So the central business district, as you look at the intents and purposes statement from the code, is to provide a location for groups of compatible commercial uses having the common characteristic of not involving more than incidental and minimal assembly, fabrication, or storage of commodities. For example, establishments dispensing retail commodities and those providing professional and personal services to the individual. The Central Business Zoning District is the most intensive commercial zoning district to promote pedestrian use. Unbroken street level commercial frontage is encouraged in the zoning district. And that's really the large driver behind not having any off-street parking requirement. If you were to require off-street parking of downtown, it would look very much like a mall with large parking lots and broken street front. It would certainly not create the pedestrian environment that is the intention of the Central Business Zoning District. Within the central business district, the current permitted principal uses include amusement and recreation facilities. So that can include bowling centers, dance halls, fitness centers, mini golf, movie theaters, actually sports arenas and stadiums currently. Financial and professional services, and that's a long list of agencies and brokerages, insurance companies, any type of professional social advocacy organizations, commercial banking, savings institutions, data processing and hosting and related services, professional technical and scientific services, publishing industries, real estate services, financial investments, software publishers. So there's kind of a long list of financial and professional offices are allowed. Food and beverage services, obviously drinking places, restaurants, and beverage manufacturing as it relates to breweries and wineries. Retail sales, again, retail sales, consumer good rentals, laundries and dry cleaners, personal care services. Public institutional uses, so civic and social organizations, community neighborhood centers, government office buildings, healthcare services, museums, and art galleries, public parks and recreation facilities, and religious facilities. Those are all allowed by right. Vehicles and equipment, so electronic repair, parking lots and garages, personal and household goods and services are allowed, and visitor accommodations. That include anything from the bed and breakfast range up through hotels, motels. Currently, all uses, as I mentioned, within the Central Business District are exempted from being required to provide off-street parking. And so this is the older table. The new table is not quite on the online code. But it just lists the use and identifies how many parking spaces have to be provided. And just ahead of that table, the Central Business District is exempted from that table for the provision of off-street parking. One of the concerns that we have heard very frequently with educational institutions have been their impact upon downtown parking. And that has been a significant point of discussion during the considerations that we've had of those. 2 of the 3 approved conditional use permits have included a requirement they provide off-street parking to mitigate their disproportionate impact. And in those scenarios, the buildings were analyzed, assumptions were made what the typical highest and best use for downtown would be of that building and the parking demand that that building would generate underneath that scenario. And any difference in parking above that number was required to be mitigated by those users. And so that was 2 of the 3. So both the new St. Andrews applications had parking mitigation that they had to conduct. The University of Idaho is the 3rd entity for the WWAMI Anatomy Lab on the 3rd floor of Gritman's new medical office building. And when we did the analysis of medical office use of that building, which is what we felt was the most comparable use, the educational institution use actually had a lower parking demand than the medical office use. And there's no parking required of any of them, but it's our way of assessing what is their disproportionate impact that may need to be mitigated, and that was the most logical way that we could see to come to that. So for the WWAMI program, then no mitigation was required in that instance. Now, conditional uses, as defined by the code, it means a use permitted in one or more zoning districts as defined by the zoning code, but which, because of the characteristics peculiar to such use, or because of size, technological processes, or equipment, or because of the exact location with reference to the surroundings, streets, and existing improvements, or demands upon public facilities, requires a special degree of control to make the use consistent with and compatible with other existing or permissible uses in the same zoning district. So the general premise is it's a permitted use in that zoning district, but it requires special review, and it requires that review to place those controls in, if there are any that are necessary, to ensure that it's consistent and compatible with surrounding land uses as well as can be served by the public infrastructure. And so it's important to recognize, I guess, that it's generally identified as being permitted use, and the only way that it truly should be denied is if there's no way to make it compatible or no way to mitigate those impacts. Otherwise, if it's been listed as a conditionally permitted use, then it's generally presumed that it will be an allowed use, unless it just has something unique about that site